Hi everyone, welcome to Ask a Property Manager episode number 82. Today is August 4th, 2021. We're coming to you from Studio 2.0 here at Own Buffalo, and I'm Andrew Schultz, Principal Broker of Own Buffalo, Inc. On today's show, we're going to be talking about the CDC extending the federal eviction moratorium yet again. We're going to talk about cosigners and self-employed applicants. We'll answer some questions from housing providers around the country, and so much more. Before we get to all that, we are going to plug our social media. New episodes of Ask a Property Manager every Wednesday morning, 10 a.m. Eastern. You can catch those live on Facebook. You can also catch the replay the same day on Facebook as well as on YouTube. Don't forget about our Instagram. We post content there that doesn't make it to the other two platforms. And last but not least, don't forget about the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. The current episode is taking a look at cosigners for college student rentals. It also talks about, does a landlord have any obligation for a tenant's mail? And last but not least, what to look for when hiring a property manager. So it's a pretty good episode. Don't miss out on that. New episodes drop every every other Thursday morning, anywhere podcasts are heard or over at rentprep.com/podcast. We're going to start off our News of the Day segment by plugging one of our new rental property listings. If you're looking for an investment property here in the Buffalo market, this might be the opportunity for you. If you're not following us on Facebook already, which you probably are if you're watching us on Facebook, if not, our website address is facebook.com/Buffalo Foreclosed Homes. We do post anything that we get in terms of an investment property. Anything that we're listing for sale does get posted on Facebook. So it's a good place to check in and see what we have going on at any given time. Anyway, back to the property, 716 Hopkins Street. This is in South Buffalo. This is near the corner of Hopkins and South Park, if you're familiar with the region. The upstairs apartment is a 2-bed, 1-bath, and it's currently vacant. The downstairs is a 2-bed, 1-bath, and it's currently rented for $750. The rent on that is going up to $775. We already have another 1-year lease signed on that, effective, I believe, September 1st. Might be October 1st. I would have to double check that. But we do have that tenant signed up for another 1-year term. And that tenant has been with us for several years and has been a very, very strong payer even through the pandemic. So you are getting at least one good tenant, and then you have the option of either an owner occupancy or placing another tenant in the upstairs unit once it's turned over, so that you can generate some real cash flow off this thing. I think next week, if this is still on the market, we're going to go ahead and do a deal analysis as part of Ask a Property Manager, so be sure to tune in for that. Until then, just a little brief info about the property. Separate gas and electric for both units, which is always crucial. We'll be talking about that more, actually, as one of our questions later in the show. We did do some updates in this property. It does need a roof. I'll be very forthright and tell you this property does need a roof. But we did just update the 2 hot water tanks, one in May of 2015, one in March of 2016. We've also put in 2 high efficiency furnaces, one in October of 13 and one in October of 20. So there have been some mechanical updates to this property, along with the traditional maintenance and everything that goes along with it. We're gonna go ahead and flip through some photos here, just so you guys can get a feel for what this property looks like. Unfortunately, the lawn was cut right after I took pictures, which sucks, but this is the downstairs unit. She keeps it in very, very good shape. She's got a very nice apartment. Wish all of our tenants kept their apartments this nice. But you can see this is actually a very, very nice apartment. Bathroom, and now we're in the upstairs. This is the vacant unit that does need turnover. The kitchen is a little bit dated, but still very serviceable. This is the dining room, a living room. You can see there's some water staining on the floor here. We're standing in the living room looking back into the dining room. This is the front bedroom, reverse of the front bedroom, and the rear bedroom, and then the bath. 2 gas meters, 2 electric meters, 2 hot water tanks, and 2 furnaces. You also have 2 electric panels, obviously, down in the basement, and these are both 100 amp services. So if you have any questions on this rental property as an investment or as an owner occupancy, if you're interested in purchasing something here in the Buffalo market, feel free to reach out. Our office number is 716-608-3200, and you can ask for me, Andrew Schultz, and I'll be glad to help you out. We're going to jump into our news of the day here. I'm sure that's what everybody's really here for. The CDC has issued a new eviction ban effective through October 3rd. This article from CNBC published this yesterday. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention issued a new federal eviction moratorium on Tuesday. The eviction ban will be targeted at areas of the country experiencing high levels of COVID infections and will last for 60 days until October 3rd. The protection could cover around 90% of renters. The CDC's original eviction ban, which had been in effect since September 2020, expired on July 31. More than 11 million Americans are behind on their rent, and the coronavirus pandemic continues to spread. Research has found evictions lead to a spike in virus cases and deaths. The White House previously had said it couldn't extend the eviction ban again after the Supreme Court ruled in June that the policy could only be renewed through legislation. It's unclear how the court will respond to this new moratorium, but it could at least buy cities and states more time to distribute the $45 billion in rental assistance allotted by Congress. Just around $3 billion of that money has reached households by the end of June. So obviously we're dealing with a little bit of a dated statistic there. We're talking about 6%, less than 7% of the funds have been distributed according to that statistic. That's fun. This is tremendous relief for millions of people who are on the cusp of losing their homes, and with them, their ability to stay safe during the pandemic. National Low-Income Housing Coalition President Diane Yentel said, President Biden's bold action and leadership in this moment of crisis will save lives and immeasurable suffering. We're going to go ahead and jump over to the CDC's website. You can see this is the temporary protection from eviction, updated August 3. CDC is issuing a new order temporarily halting evictions in counties with heightened levels of community transmission in order to respond to recent unexpected developments in the trajectory of the COVID-19 pandemic, including the rise of the Delta variant. It's intended to target specific areas of the country where cases are rapidly increasing, which likely would be exacerbated by mass evictions. And then there's a copy of the order here, which I've already pulled up and done some highlighting on. We're going to go through this relatively quickly. I think you guys are pretty familiar with what these things look like at this point. But there are a couple of key features in here that I do want to talk about. If you do want to get a copy of this, again, you can go right over to the CDC's website. Just type into Google CDC Eviction Moratorium or CDC New Eviction Moratorium. It's the first thing that pops up on Google. You can't really miss it. But here's a copy of that PDF. This is the actual order that's been signed. We're going to scroll through here and just hit some of the more pertinent parts here that I wanted to pull out. Obviously, they start by defining a bunch of different things, such as what is available government assistance, available housing, etc. Then they get into covered person, and I'm going to read through this here. The one thing, before I read this, the one thing that's not clear to me is if a covered person has to hit just one of these criteria, or if they have to hit all of these criteria. And I'm checking my phone right now because I'd actually emailed one of our attorneys earlier today to see if they had any insight, and I haven't heard back on that yet. So the covered person means any tenant, lessee, or resident of a residential property provides to their landlord, the owner of the residential property, or other person with a legal right to pursue eviction, a declaration under penalty of perjury indicating that, number one, the individual has used the individual has used best efforts to obtain all available government assistance for rent or housing. Number two, the individual either earned no more than $99,000 or $198,000 if filing jointly in calendar year 2020, or expects to earn no more than $99,000 in annual income for calendar year 21, no more than $198,000 if filing a joint return. Point two, was not required to report any income in 2020 to the IRS, or point three, received an economic impact payment, a stimulus check. Scrolling down onto the next page, and you can see that they have a ton of different footnotes in here. We're going to look at a couple of these footnotes in a little bit, but this is basically where they're defining all of the things that they're already defining in the definition section. It's a pretty dense order the way that they've worded this here. Part three, the individual is unable to pay the full rent or make a full housing payment due to substantial loss of household income, loss of compensable hours of work or wages, a layoff, or extraordinary out-of-pocket medical expenses. Point four, the individual is using best efforts to make timely partial rent payments that are as close to the full rent payment as the individual's circumstances may permit, taking into account other non-discretionary expenses. Part five, eviction would likely render the individual homeless or force the individual to move into and reside in close quarters in a new congregate or shared living setting because the individual has no other available housing options And number 6, this is the new piece. The individual resides in a U.S. county experiencing substantial or high rates of community transmission levels of SARS-CoV-2 as defined by the CDC. You see there's 2 footnotes here, footnote 9 and 10. I did come down here and pull this down. It's interesting how they're coming up with what they consider to be the substantial and high, how did they define it? Substantial and high rates of community transmission. This is how they're actually defining that, these 2 footnotes, section 9 and section 10 here. And essentially what I did was went and pulled the county view, which we're going to look at here in a couple minutes. This is probably going to be the easiest way to determine if your area is covered by this moratorium or not. So that's the one thing here that has been added. You have to be in a geographic region that's experiencing substantial or high rates of community transmission of COVID-19 as defined by CDC. They clearly say how they're making that definition, and they give you a place where you can go to look to see if your geographic region is covered. We're going to look at that after we're done with this PDF here. We're going to keep moving forward. Scrolling forward here, background, this is basically them talking about everything that's happened thus far up to this point. In areas of substantial or high transmission, CDC recommends community leaders encourage vaccination and universal masking in indoor public spaces, in addition to other layered prevention strategies to prevent further spread. That's obviously starting to become more and more of a thing here nationwide. Scrolling down. I did not sit and highlight everything in this article or in this order. A lot of the information that I'm scrolling past right now is just generic background information. You could certainly sit and read through it if you want to. I'm sure it will provide you some insight as to the whys and hows of what they're doing and why they think that this is the route to go. But I think that at this point, we've all pretty much gotten the point and we understand what it is that they're trying to accomplish here. Applicability. This order applies in U.S. counties experiencing substantial and high levels of community transmission as defined by CDC as of August 3rd, 2021. If a county that is not covered under this order as of August 3rd, 2021 later experiences substantial or high levels of community transmission while the order is in effect, then that county will become subject to this order as of the date the county begins experiencing the substantial or high risk of community transmission. If a U.S. county that is covered by this order no longer experiences substantial or high levels of community transmission for 14 consecutive days, this order will no longer apply in that county unless and until that county again experiences substantial or high levels of community transmission while this order is in effect. So you may not be impacted by this right now, but if you have a COVID spike in your county, you could suddenly become impacted by this. The flip side of that is also true. If you are in an area that is high impact and your county's levels of COVID transmission drop, your county may come off of this list. This order does not apply to any state, local, territorial, or tribal area with a moratorium on residential evictions that take place, residential evictions that provides the same or greater level of public health protection than the requirements listed in this order, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if you have a state mandate or a local mandate that is stronger than the federal moratorium, then that would supersede. This order does not relieve any individual of any obligation to pay rent. Obviously, we already understand that. I think that's been written into every single one of these orders, but it's not necessarily being followed. Nothing in this order precludes the charging or collecting of fees, penalties, or interest as a result of failure to pay rent. That tells me that late fees, non-sufficient funds fees, things like that, those should be back on the table as part of this moratorium. Again, check your locals and your state moratoriums. You may have something in there that supersedes what they're saying at the federal level. Nothing in this order precludes evictions based on a tenant, lessee, or resident engaging in criminal activity while on the premises, threatening the health of safety or other residents, damaging or posing an immediate and significant risk of damage to the property, violating any applicable building code, health ordinance, or similar regulation regarding health and safety, or 5, violating any other contractual obligation other than the timely payment of rent or similar housing-related payment, including non-payment of late payment of fees, penalties, or interest. Essentially, this is opening the door for the nuisance evictions that we're constantly talking about. Tenants who are dealing drugs out of a property, tenants who are causing damage to a property, tenants who are threatening or harassing or injuring other tenants in the building. You should still be available to evict under those terms. We're simply talking about a non-payment here. Any eviction for non-payment of rent initiated prior to the issuance of this order but not yet completed are subject to this order. Any tenant, lease, or resident of a residential property who previously submitted a declaration still qualifies as a covered person and is still present in a rental unit entitled to protections under this order. Any eviction that was completed before the issuance of this order, including from August 1 to August 3, 2021, that's the 3-day gap between when things were closed, when the previous eviction moratorium ended and the new one began, which, I mean, look at this. If it ended on the 31st, you're talking about Monday, Tuesday would have been the 2 available days for filing of evictions. I don't imagine there were a lot of those that were filed, but even if you did get one in, it's not considered subject to this order as it does not operate retroactively. Under this order, covered persons may be evicted for engaging in criminal activity while on the premises. They may not be evicted based solely on the allegation. So you have to have some sort of proof. More than likely, you're going to have to prove that they have been arrested for criminal activity or something along those lines in order to get that sort of a coverage or that sort of an eviction. Scrolling down, individuals who are confirmed to who have been exposed to or might have COVID-19 and take reasonable precautions to not spread the disease may not be evicted on the grounds that they pose a public health risk or safety risk to other residents. This order is in effect through October 3rd, 2021, based on the current and projected context of the SARS-CoV-2 transmission throughout the United States. This time frame will allow for the assessment of natural changes to the COVID-19 incidence and the influences of new variants, additional distribution of emergency rental assistance funds, and the expansion of the vaccine uptake. Declaration forms. To qualify for the protections of this order, a tenant must provide a completed and signed copy of a declaration with the elements listed in the definition of covered person to their landlord, owner of the residential property where they live, blah, 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 blah. They have to provide you a copy of their declaration. There is a standardized declaration that they can use. There's a link to it right there. And then it goes on to talk about what other sorts of declarations they can use if not using the CDC form. This order does not preclude a landlord from challenging the truthfulness of a tenant's, lessee's, or resident's declaration in court as permitted under state or local law. So this tells me that in the event that you have a tenant who has given you this declaration, but you know that that tenant is just flat out lying. For instance, you know that that tenant was not COVID impacted or has been working the entire time or whatever the case may be, you should have the right to argue that in court that the tenant is using the declaration outside of the way that the declaration is supposed to be used. So in theory, you should be able to challenge that in court even during this time frame. Scrolling down here, I think that pretty much wraps up everything I wanted to hit on here. We're coming up on the last page. Effective date goes into effect August 3rd, runs through October 3rd, et cetera, and that's the last page of the actual federal eviction moratorium, the new one. Quite a bit to wrap your mind around there. So this is not nearly as blanket as what the last one would be considered. You do have some options here. Whether or not the courts actually open and actually start hearing cases for non-payment, they should be. The way I read this, the way I interpret this, and I'm not an attorney by any means, you should certainly be talking to an attorney at this point before filing any sort of an eviction action. I think it would be very unwise to not contact an attorney before you start thinking about an eviction action, given the current political and legal and legislative climate that we're dealing with. You really want to have a professional on your side in this instance. This is not something where you want to try to white knuckle the wheel and get through it on your own. Hire a professional. But anyway, the way I'm interpreting this, and again, I'm not an attorney, the way I'm looking at this is there should be open courts such that we can start proceeding with these evictions. And if somebody is putting in a declaration, then you have the right to argue against their declaration. Whether or not that actually happens or not is anybody's guess. It's one of those situations where you would hope that they do the right thing and at least open the court so that we can start hearing some of these cases and maybe clear some of this backlog of the cases where you know that a tenant is taking advantage of the moratorium, for lack of a better term. Some of those cases should be able to proceed through here. We shouldn't be dragging these things out even longer, but it really is going to boil down to whether the states start hearing these eviction cases. They're going to have to start hearing them eventually, sooner rather than later, I would say. But I think that there's going to be a demand for people to start hearing these cases especially when you have carve-outs in here for things like the truthfulness of a declaration. Like, you have to have some sort of the ability for a housing provider to argue their case in court. You can't just drag this on forever. So this is where we're at. We're back under the federal moratorium from August 3rd until October 3rd. It's not as blanket as what it was. I do highly recommend that you contact an attorney and sit down and look through this order and really understand what it means for you and your individual set of circumstances. The one last thing I wanted to talk about before we move on is this COVID data tracker. The CDC's website does have this COVID data tracker, and we're talking about areas of substantial and areas of high risk. So right now, for instance, I have New York State pulled up. You can see that in Niagara County, New York, Niagara County is considered, Niagara County is considered an area of substantial risk for transmission. It's covered under this moratorium. Erie County, same thing. Orleans County is considered an area of low level of community transmission. So this moratorium technically does not apply in Orleans County. Looking downstate, Nassau County is considered high. And I apologize. I don't know if I can zoom in here. Oh, that'll make it a little easier. Actually, it won't because this map is really poorly built. Queens County, substantial. So, I mean, you can see what's going on. Downstate obviously looks a little bit rougher than upstate does here at the moment. But really, the majority of New York State is going to be impacted here. Let's go back to the US map just to get a feeling. And I'm hoping this will load up here. All counties, level of transmission. There we go. So they talk about in the order, and I don't know if I highlighted it. The number that I saw when I was looking at this last night was 80%. Let me just do a search for 80%. As of August 1, 2021, over 80% of U.S. counties were classified as experiencing substantial or high levels of community transmission. Over 80%. So looking at the national map, I think you can see that there's a whole lot of red and a whole lot of orange on this map. Basically, anything that you're seeing that's either yellow or blue, those are going to be the areas that are not covered under this current moratorium. So, you know, New York State, we do have quite a bit of yellow. There are quite a few areas in New York State. There's even some blue in New York State. But obviously the most populous areas being like Erie, Niagara County, and then downstate New York City, those areas are seeing substantial risk of transmission. California is a mess. Texas is a mess. Pretty much the entire, rest of the country is kind of a mess when it comes to the current status of community level transmission, according to the CDC guidelines. So take that for what you will. Take the statistics for what they are. But that's where you're at. You can find this information on the CDC's website. You can just type CDC COVID data tracker into Google and that'll pop right up. So there you go. That is the current state of affairs as far as the current state of evictions go here in the United States, and at least a little look here locally into the Buffalo, Erie, Niagara, Orleans, Genesee County market area. We're going to go ahead and jump into some humor. I think we could all use a little bit after that. That was kind of a bummer. Both of these images today come from the Trust But Verify department. Complete WTF moment at a showing when you wonder why the fireplace insert is a little wonky, and then you try to move the insert and the whole thing comes open. There's no actual fireplace there. Somebody literally just slapped a faux fireplace. Oh man, I would be so mad if I saw that. And this next one's not much better. This is what happens when you hire the budget roofer and they put a roof they put a roof vent on your property for you. Yeah, trust but verify. Just because somebody that says they know what they're doing does not mean that they actually know what they're doing. And that's pretty good proof of that. So we're going to go ahead and jump into our questions from housing providers around the country here, starting with this one on leasing to students as a cosigner required. So I'm leasing to a student. Has anyone rented to a student from out of town? The parents would be paying the rent. Does the lease go in the parent's name? And is there anything I should look out for? So when you have students on a lease, you put the students on a lease and you put the parents on a guarantor form. At least that's the way that we do it here in our office. They're two completely separate documents. The guarantor form does list, it references the lease, but it's a separate document from the lease. And on the guarantor form, we have the tenant, the guarantor, and us all signing it. So everybody's on the same page. As far as screening goes, you're going to screen these people the exact same way as you would any other tenant. Screen everyone over 18, including the cosigners. And when you're screening the cosigners, they need to meet all of the same criteria that your tenant needs to meet. The one exception to that might be the landlord reference. And the reason I say that is if somebody's owned a house for 20 years, they're not going to have a landlord reference, but you can verify that through tax records. So there's other ways to go about verifying. One thing I will mention is that if you're considering using a cosigner, that cosigner needs to have more than 3 times the rent in income. My recommendation is 4.5 times the rent net income. That is the guideline that we use here in our office for cosigners. And the reason we use that cosigner or that guideline is because a cosigner needs to be able to pay not just their own expenses, but also needs to be able to pay this rent. In this instance, it sounds like this tenant is strictly relying on parental support for the rent to be paid. So you definitely want to make sure that those parents have enough income to support their current expenses plus the expense of this apartment. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Find a way of addressing the most common lease issue that we have when it comes to students and parents and cosigners is you're going to get phone calls from parents and they're going to want to discuss different aspects of the lease with you. You need to find a way of dealing with that on the front end. Either make your lease such that the tenant is authorizing you to speak to the guarantor on their behalf, or something along those lines. You're going to have issues if you have a tenant that's, we'll call it what it is. We're talking about a student. You're talking about somebody that's probably in the 18 to 22 age bracket, and they aren't necessarily the most adulty adults, if we're being honest. I mean, I'm sure we can all remember what we used to do when we were young, and I guarantee you that we can all look back and say, that probably wasn't the most responsible decision. So you're probably going to want to be able to talk to these parents, and those parents are probably going to want to be able to speak to you. So find a way of making that work on the front end such that everybody's on the same page as to when it's appropriate to communicate, when it's not appropriate to communicate, what you can help them with and what you can't help them with. And I think that you'll find that that'll eliminate, we used to get, when we had our student rentals, we used to get a lot of calls from parents complaining about one student complaining about another student, but rather than the students working it out themselves, the parents would call us and demand that we fix it. No, that's not our problem. Your student chose to live with those other students. We didn't put them in that building with a bunch of randos. They picked their roommates. They need to work out their own arguments. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about dealing with, determining who you're going to deal with when it comes to the actual lease. But yeah, if you're going to rent to students, unless it's a student that has substantial assets or a student that is showing you that they have income from maybe a student loan program, or that they're working in addition to renting, in addition to going to school, something along those lines, a paid internship, something along those lines, you're going to want a cosigner. If your student doesn't meet the 3 times the rent income requirement, net income requirement, then you're going to want to have that cosigner at 4.5 times the rent net income. On to our next question, also a leasing related question. Screening self-employed applicants. We got an applicant who put their job as a self-employed mushroom forager on mushroom sales. Is this code for drugs? I mean, maybe. People do actually go foraging for mushrooms, so who knows? Some of those mushrooms are very, very expensive if you find the rare ones. It's not my thing. Like, I don't care about mushrooms. I don't like them in my food or anything like that. But if they have a legitimate business, if they are legitimately self-employed, then you would screen this tenant just the same way that you would any other self-employed individual. We look at previous year's tax returns. We want to see what they're showing in terms of income for the previous year. We also want to see a current year's profit and loss statement with bank statements to verify. So if they say that they have made, we'll just use round numbers of $50,000 this year harvesting mushrooms, I want to see their profit and loss statement, and I want to see their bank statement showing, yep, they've actually legitimately made that 50 grand foraging for mushrooms, I guess, for lack of a better term. Make sure that they meet all of your requirements. Screen them the same way that you would any other tenant. Make sure that they have the correct income requirement. Do your credit and background checks if they're allowable in your area, and then make your decision. But make your decision based off of factual information, not just the fact that they list a very random occupation on their application. Generally speaking, most drug dealers don't run their cash through their bank accounts. If you have a legitimate business with this mushroom forager, chances are they're going to be able to show you that they are a legitimate business. They're going to be able to prove it, for lack of a better term. The only way to figure that out is to screen the tenant. Would I be off-put by somebody saying they're a mushroom forager? I mean, that's definitely the strangest, the strangest occupation I've seen on a rental application. But people make money all sorts of ways. I mean, there are a million different. How many people thought that they would be able to make a living putting videos up on YouTube 10 years ago? You know, there are a million different ways to make money in this world. Many of them are legitimate. Some of them are illegitimate. Your job is to determine whether this person has the ability to pay your rent with a lawful source of income. That's my opinion on that. Good luck. Hopefully you figure out what you're going to do with your mushroom forager. That's such a weird occupation. Keep a single family or convert to multi. I'm about to close on a 5-bedroom in Township, Illinois that needs to be completely redone. The house has a full basement and is extremely long. Should I keep it a 5-bedroom, or should I split it into two-bedroom duplexes? One duplex, 2 units, each having 2 bedrooms in it, just for clarification purposes. As of right now, I only have 1 rental. It's a 3-bed, 2-bath in Township, Illinois. Also, if I do the change, should I rewire it and have 2 electric services, or just include the utilities in the rent? So my preference here would be a duplex. I think we talked last week about, investing in single families versus duplexes, or multifamilies rather. My preference is always the more units, the better. And the reason for that is if you have a single family and it's vacant, 0 rev. If you have a multifamily and 1 unit is vacant, you have revenue coming through the door. So my preference is always multiple streams of revenue. It's always better, in my opinion, in case something goes vacant or you have a non-payer or whatever the case may be. Next thing I would do would be talk to the city and find out, hey, are they even going to permit you to convert this to a duplex? Some cities give you a lot more leeway than others, but you definitely want to think about, okay, if I'm going to do this conversion, obviously you're pulling all sorts of permits and inspections and everything else. The city's going to know what's going on. So you might want to talk to them on the front end and see if that would be an allowable use for the parcel that you currently have. That might actually make your determination for you right there. If they say, no, you can't rehab this into a duplex, guess what? You've got a 5-bed. So if you're going to do the duplex, my recommendation is to split the utilities when you rehab. The reason I say that is because you already mentioned here that you have a need for a complete redo. I assume that means that you're going to be gutting some of this property and things of that nature. If you're already at the point where you're going that far into a rehab, the cost to split the utilities out probably is not going to be so extreme that it's not worth pursuing. The reason I say that is because you live in Illinois, which is a cold weather climate. At the end of the day, and actually you don't mention anything about gas service in here, so I'm wondering if you're using electric heat or if there's a gas service that's just not mentioned. But if you're using electric heat and you're paying for the utilities as a landlord, that is going to be a very expensive winter heating bill. It's not going to be the kind of bill that you're going to want to tackle. It's one of those situations where, yeah, you're going to charge more in rent to cover that utility bill, but that's going to be very, very expensive come wintertime to eat the entire cost of all of the heating utilities for that building. My recommendation would be split those utilities out, let the tenants take care of their own electric bills. It's going to make it a lot easier for everybody involved. Splitting the utilities obviously does mean that there's an added cost. You're going to want to determine if it makes sense to split the utilities or not based on getting quotes. What is it going to cost to have a second meter channel put in, a second breaker panel put in, and to run all new wiring to wherever you need to run it to for the second unit. And then since you're, making a bunch of electrical changes, are you losing all the grandfathering on everything that's already there, in existence currently? You probably are, which means you're probably rerunning that entire unit too. You might be doing it already. It sounds like you're doing a rehab, but there's a lot of factors that kind of go into play here. Just want to make sure I hit all of my points here. On the back end, a couple of considerations to think about on the back end of doing something like this would be your assessment and your taxation. Your assessment's obviously going to go up when you convert something from a single family to a 2-family. Your assessment's going to go up anyway because you're about to dump a bunch of money into this property, and the city's eventually going to reassess you regardless, simply because you put so much of an improvement into the property. Your taxes are going to go up. You want to talk to your township and find out, is there a different tax basis for single family versus multifamily? Here in Buffalo, they call it homestead versus non-homestead, and it covers up to 4 units. So if you have 4 or less units, it's considered homestead tax. If you have 5 or more units, or you're in a commercial or a mixed-use building, then it would be considered non-homestead, and you pay a much higher property tax rate on those structures. So that's something to keep in mind, is what is the tax situation going to look like? Because you're going to need to factor that into your calculations to determine if this is worthwhile for you to do or not. So you have a lot of things to consider before you jump into a situation like this. A lot of things. You're talking about everything from 2 kitchens, 2 bathrooms, et cetera, et cetera. It's a lot to consider. Take your time, do your math, figure out the best possible option for you and your unique investing situation, and then roll forward and figure it out. I think that you've got a great opportunity here. I didn't include a picture of the property, but I did see a picture of it online. Looks like a nice little property, and I think you're going to do very well with it. It's just a matter of figuring out what makes the most sense for you and your unique situation. So this episode's gone on long enough. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up here. Thank you all so much for watching. We love producing Ask a Property Manager, and you can always help us improve by dropping a question in the comments either on Facebook or on YouTube, and your question may be picked up and answered in an upcoming episode. If you enjoyed this content, or if we brought some value to you today, do us a favor and hit that thumbs up button. YouTube and Facebook both push videos based on community feedback, so every like, comment, subscribe, and share helps us to grow and reach more people. We'll be back next week on Wednesday, August 11th at 10 a.m. Eastern with another show you won't want to miss. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.